Hey Wapters, Mr. Lassiter here with you. This video is a little late, so apologies on that. Hopefully it will upload in the meantime. Uh, so let's go ahead and get started. We're still looking at this challenge of economic and social change, and we're going to be looking today at situations with slavery, women's rights, and industrialization in the Western Hemisphere. So take a look at our big ideas. Mainly, we're looking and seeing that even though these nations are founded on Enlightenment ideas, they really fail to live up to those ideas of freedom and liberty. Slavery and oppressive institutions are going to slow progress in these nations. But by the end of the 1800s, we do see that slavery is abolished, voting rights are expanded, and immigrants have assimilated into many of these countries, although it will not be as easy as me saying that. There's going to be increased industrialization, but this is going to be a challenge for many countries in the Western Hemisphere. And in general, industrialized nations such as the United States are going to become richer than those who exported raw materials. But all of them being tied into this global market are going to become vulnerable to worldwide ebbs and flows of the economy. Of their economies. And of course that will come into major play in the 1900s. So let's go ahead and get going. This might be a little long. So we're going to start out with the abolition of slavery. Of course, as I mentioned, many of these countries are founded on ideas of freedom and being free from oppressors, yet they still relied quite a bit on slavery. Slavery, though, was much more prominent and it was strongest in areas where exporting cash crops was the most important. For example, in the United States, the American South relied much more on exporting agricultural products and therefore relied much more on slavery. Places like Brazil, Cuba, Puerto Rico, same idea. In the early 1800s, though, we see the beginnings of the weakening of slavery. Northern states of the United States abolish it. The slave trade in the United States ends, so to speak, in 1808. Coming in from other places, there's still trade within the country. And in Spanish, the new countries of Spanish America, many slaves are freed when they join revolutionary armies. And we'll also see that kind of theme go into Brazil later on. Anyways. In the United States, abolitionists tried to make moral arguments or religious arguments against slavery. Some of the most famous, of course, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But women and free African Americans, two groups, mind you, that are denied their full rights, play the largest roles in the abolition movement. The most famous, probably, abolition document is the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in rebelling territories of the South. So basically everywhere the Union had not yet reclaimed. But it was the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the first of the three Reconstruction Amendments, that actually ends slavery all over the country and outlaws it. At the same time this is happening in the United States and we see slavery coming to an end, there is an increase in international demand for cash crops elsewhere. And so we see slave imports increase in places like Brazil and Cuba. In Brazil, the abolition of slavery is much slower. It depends on a lot of British pressure on them to end slavery, and also comes to an end as a result of former slaves joining the Brazilian army. And so by joining the army, they show kind of their usefulness, their worth, their equality to other people in Brazil. And so abolitionist movement kind of speeds up a little bit, and ultimately in 1888 slavery is abolished all over Brazil. In the Caribbean, we see very little support for abolition, but ultimately the British Caribbean colonies end slavery. And part of that was an economic decision. Profits had already started declining, but also a moral decision. This picture over to the right is a common image circulated around Britain. trying to end slavery. The French colonies end slavery completely after King Louis Philippe is ousted in 1848 in the revolution in France that kicks off the revolutions of 1848. 1873, it's abolished in Puerto Rico, and 1886 in Cuba. But as slavery ends, immigration from Europe and Asia increase, especially in the United States, as you can see by this map, or excuse me, by this chart. Uh, Europe provides the majority of immigrants to the Western Hemisphere, but as you may have studied before, immigration on the west coast of the United States comes primarily from Asia. But Asian immigrants, especially Chinese immigrants to California, face much discrimination and violence in the United States, but also in other places like Canada, Mexico, Cuba, Peru. Um, and so we see this more and more struggle between people who are here in the Americas and people who are now coming to the Americas and bringing their culture along with them. Um, Immigrants from Europe also face prejudice as well, so it wasn't just limited to the Asians, as you see in this poster, which simply kind of really fought against Chinese immigration. And in fact, Chinese immigration is going to be restricted in the United States with the Chinese Exclusion Act. But schools, in particular, were used to create homogenous national culture, which basically means to assimilate different immigrants. So to get them all speaking English, for example, in the United States, or all having the same cultural values, or all valuing the same, or having the same patriotic feelings for America. That would be a type of assimilation that had been practiced over and over again. And so that is going to be largely what kind of has the United States move past issues with European or Asian immigration. But despite this discrimination, immigrants alter the politics of the hemisphere. They influence government policies of different countries in the Western Hemisphere. They do adapt, but they also at the same time bring their culture in language, art, music, and all this will basically create kind of the idea of the melting pot in the United States. But we also see this immigration, as you've read, in other nations in the Western Hemisphere. So it does occur in other countries, not just the U.S., but it is a nice example that we can use for what you're familiar with. Of course, women also were fighting for rights, so it's not just abolition movement and immigrants coming. Women who were here and were also coming over were denied rights. So women's movements we see make very slow progress. A lot of this is kind of pushed on by the idea that women are doing more and more work, especially during the Industrial Revolution, taking jobs outside the home. Though I would say that most of the people fighting for women's rights are not going to be the ones taking jobs outside the home. It's not necessarily the working class women who are pushing for equality, though they would gladly accept it. It culminates really in this really big convention in 1848, the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls. And they were very upset because they had been kind of excluded from an abolition conference. And so women come together and they sign this Declaration of Sentiments. And you can see the signatures listed over at the right, or the printout of the people who signed it. And what this said, basically it was modeled on the Declaration of Independence, and it just argued that women should also receive natural rights, and that men were the ones who were oppressing them and not giving them their full rights. Many of you may have actually read this document when you were working on your document-based question projects, if you did it on women's rights. Anyways, women still don't get the right to vote until about 1920, 42 years after an amendment is introduced into Congress. So it's going to be quite a long time before women actually get to realize probably the most sacred or basic of these rights, the right to vote. Progress is equally slow in Canada and in the rest of Latin America for women's rights. And again, despite the abolition of slavery, and I feel like this might be a little too obvious, who knows, having to say this, but there was still segregation and still a lot of discrimination toward people of African descent. Of course, segregation prominent throughout the American South. In Latin America, racial identity is not necessarily viewed as simply black and white. It was a continuum, but it does not mean there was not discrimination there. Um, Men and women of African descent everywhere are going to be discriminated against, um, and people of mixed descent, especially successful people of mixed descent, face fewer obstacles in Latin America than they did in the United States. Again, the United States viewed things mostly as black and white, whereas in Latin America it was kind of more of a continuum of um, mixed race and people from you know back home in Spain, or those who had been born in the Americas, or those who had significant Spanish descent, or those who were mixed, and then how much so were you of mixed descent. So all that played into this kind of continuum of discrimination, sadly. All right, our last topic really is looking at the development and underdevelopment of the Western Hemisphere. Um, and keep in mind that almost all the countries in the Western Hemisphere experience economic growth, but the United States is really the only one to industrialize completely. The United States, Canada, and Argentina have living standards that end up similar to those in Western Europe, but they are uh, kind of the exception. Not everywhere in the Western Hemisphere is able to achieve this. Some of the things that helped these countries grow economically during the 19th century are the rising demand for mining products, so booms in the United States, Mexico, and Chile uh, for things that are mined, for example, gold, the gold rush in California and Alaska, etc. Um, we see European and North American corporations playing significant roles in developing the mining industry in Latin America. But again, those countries are going to end up exporting raw materials and are not necessarily going to be industrializing kind of for long-term health of their countries. As the Western Hemisphere participated in the world market, they became more dependent on it, and they also were engaging in competition. And so there were deep kind of structural differences among Western Hemisphere economies. We see they're not all tied to the same thing. The United States can be very different than, say, uh, Brazil or Chile. Those nations that do industrialize, or industrialize more so than others, achieve prosperity and development. We call them developed economies. Whereas those nations that just exported raw materials and they relied on paying people low wages, those experience underdevelopment. Um, so there are some reasons why maybe the United States and Canada are able to become developed and Latin America underdeveloped. And part of it lies in the time when they gained their independence. The United States and Canada gain independence during a time of global expansion. So immediately after they gain uh, kind of after they become independent nations, sovereign nations, they're able to grow their economy. Whereas Latin America experiences this in the 1820s when the global economy is contracting. So after achieving independence, they don't have immediate successes, and therefore it leads to weak governments, political instability, and of course civil wars, which slow development in Latin America. Latin America becomes very dependent on Britain and the United States for any technology or capital that they need to build up their economies. Whereas the United States and Canada did not need this because they were expanding, expanding, expanding. Of course, as a result of expansion, we have environmental issues, population growth, industrialization, of course, new plants and animals coming over, lead to environmental disaster, deforestation, soil exhaustion, erosion, strains on water systems, sewage, garbage disposal systems. Basically, um, we we kind of just destroy our environment, of course, as we are wont to do. The mining industry leads to erosion and pollution in, of course, places like the United States, Chile, and Brazil, where it's very important. Um, and of course, as the population grows, there's demand for land and food and housing. And so, again, more and more environmental stress placed on the Western Hemisphere. But there was a choice to be made, which is basically have your economy grow as your population grows, or protect the environment. And as has been done basically throughout all of history, the decision was made for economic growth. That was the choice. And so we don't see the same, we don't see things like we do today with environmental protection. It was simply continue growing to try to maintain stability in your economy. All right, so we've gone through so much on this chapter, and we've gone through it in quite a lot of detail, even in these notes, even more detail than I'm telling you. So just to wrap up everything really we've done on this whole unit, keep in mind that once colonial rule is overturned, in the Western Hemisphere we see these countries becoming independent, it was very difficult to create stable and functioning governments. Industrialization transforms the hemisphere, but the United States is going to emerge as the most industrialized nation during this time, so by 1900. And by 1900, we have stronger, wealthier, better educated, more democratic, and more populous countries than at the time of independence, whether it was 1776 with the U.S. or the 1820s with many of the countries of Latin America. But they're also more vulnerable because they are now involved in a global, international economy. And so as the international economy goes, so go the economies of these Western nations. And so we see also the development of a split between those who have money or are rich and are kind of the leaders of industrialization, and those who are working the low-wage jobs that come along with the Industrial Revolution. That's it. That's the end of all of this. So I hope you've enjoyed your break. I hope you enjoy your snow day tomorrow, which is hopefully when you're watching this. As far as your quiz on Monday, or on well, that was supposed to be tomorrow. We'll take it Wednesday or Thursday or whenever we see each other again. Have a good night, Wepters. Enjoy it.